Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Educators Ag Institute. Today is Forestry in Forest in Pennsylvania. I'm Cassidy, I'll be your host, but first we have a little bit of housekeeping. There is a link to the pretest in the chat box. If you have not taken that, please do so now. It does help us to see how much you're learning. Also, we cannot see or hear you for the rest of the session. So if you need to say something, there is a chat box. If you want everyone to see everything, make sure it says all panelists and attendees in the little drop down. Now, at times we can ask questions from our presenters. So there is another Q&A box and you can put your questions in that, and we'll get to them later on. And also just please be respectful. Everything is visible to everyone else. So we want everyone to have a good session. So I am going to hand it over to our presenters, Sandy and Dave.
Okay, thank you, Cassidy. And we'll get started here to introduce ourselves first. As Cassidy mentioned, I'm Sandy. That's my nickname, Smith. And my colleague and partner in crime this morning is Dave Jackson. And we are both with Penn State Extension. We'll spare you all the details about our work and careers and such, but we're happy to answer questions as we go along. And the first program, we're going to have three different programs this morning. The first about forests and the history of our forests in Pennsylvania. I hope it won't be a sleeper, but interesting to you. And please put questions as we go along, and we'll get to them either at the end of this presentation, if there's a little extra time, or towards the very end of our full time together this morning.
And then Dave? I'm going to jump in with a presentation entitled Forest and Forestry that I'm going to try to make interactive with having you help me out with some questions that I'll be posing throughout the presentation.
And then finally, we'll wrap up with a session on teaching about forests and wildlife and some of the resources that we've shared through links with you, as well as some of the resources that we recommend that we've worked with for many years. Okay, so I am going to jump to our first call. Let's see if we get it here. There we go. And we want to go to full screen. And that should be right there. Let's see. Oops. Can I share that all the way, or do I have to?
And you hit the little icon down in the lower right. That'll make it go to, there you go. You got it now.
Yeah, we got it. Okay, I want to take that, at least on my screen, take that little power bar there off. Okay, so this is the story of Penn's Woods. In regards to its natural history and its cultural history. And by cultural, I mean the people that interacted with the forest. And I think a lot of people find this interesting. They also have connections, perhaps you do. And if you do have some family connection that you know about, I'd love to learn about that. You can put it in the chat, especially as we go along and look at pictures. And there are a lot of pictures in this slide set here. I'm going to go rather quickly, but you may see somebody that looks like grandpa or great-grandpa or something that you heard about in your family's history. So this is really a kind of a lesson in appreciation today. This is not to condemn the way people used to manage things or do things in the past at all. This is, of course, to just talk about what really happened here in Pennsylvania. Okay, let's try these things here. So there we go. Okay, so when people look at the forests in Pennsylvania today, they often think, well, gosh, it's always been this way. It's always been heavily forested, and it's a beautiful place. And this is just what it looked like when the Native Americans lived here. Well, in fact, it was very forested at that time, but these are different forests that we have today. These are forests that have grown back after many kinds of activities that people carried out on the land. And excuse me, my battery's going low. There we go, plug it in. And then, and the trees, the composition of the forest, the types of trees that were growing here, while there are many of the same trees, some are different. And the trees were definitely older back at, 400 years ago when Native Americans were living here and Europeans had not settled in this area. When Native Americans were here, their use of the forest was actually fairly extensive. At least more so than people think. They did practice agriculture. It was mostly what sometimes is referred to as slash and burn, where areas were cut and burned, and then beans and corn and squash and such were planted in those burned areas for a few years. And then when the soil kind of played out a little bit, they moved to another area. They also used the wood from the forest to create fortresses, so to speak, or protective areas, and their homes. Wigwams were kind of the home of the day during Native American time, and they were made from wood, in the frame, and then bark, and everything in their home, was almost generated from forests and wood, as well as animal bones and skin and stone. So their transportation, of course, was dugout canoes or bark canoes, and their homes were largely manufactured from forest materials. Their places of meeting and their places of gathering were often just in forested areas, as shown in this picture. But fire was a tool that our Native American people used, and fire was used effectively for several different things. And one was to drive game. So they may be trying to hunt an area and push an area out, and fire was used in that sense. I mentioned fire was used to clear areas for agriculture, and fire was used to stimulate production of forest plants, especially things like berries and such, where you wanted to open it up, get more sunlight, and fires were used to do that and to stimulate berry production. So fire was a tool that was used very actively. And in fact, we use fire far less today than they did back then, but we're starting to use it more with what we call prescribed burning. So prescribed burning is not wildfires that are just randomly happening across the landscape. They were today we use fire as a tool as well, not as extensively as we could or perhaps should, but we still do use it. All right. When European settlement occurred in Pennsylvania and the Northeast here, of course, they used the forest to build their log cabins and log homes. Stone was also used in those homes, but a big use for the forests was to heat their homes, stay warm. And that's why that little pile of wood there is at the bottom. But lots of times when areas were being cleared, they really couldn't deal with all the wood that was there, and they would girdle the trees. In other words, chop all the way around them to kill them and leave them standing there, and they would slowly die and the branches would drop out and the trees would rot away. They were not used extensively in small agricultural areas where they were too far from any kind of market to sell the wood. So agriculture was the name of the game, so to speak, for European settlers, and they were actually growing their food, planting and growing their food, as opposed to hunting and gathering. Their livestock was the first kind of big ecological change in the forest, where livestock were allowed to roam freely, pigs and cows and goats and other animals, and they did havoc in the forest in many areas. They ate the understory, they ate the seeds from chestnuts and oaks and things like that, and they really had a big impact on forests, differently than the way it was just with Native Americans living here who didn't raise domesticated livestock. One of the first big industries for Pennsylvania's forest, at least using Pennsylvania's forest products, was the naval industry, right? The ships and such. The tall masts were pines that were harvested in our forests of Pennsylvania. The ships were made of oak, white oak, and many other species of trees here in Pennsylvania were used for the manufacture of ships and such. And those countries that had the navies, the large navies, were the ones that controlled the world. It was really the internet of the day, the sailing ships, and our forests provided a lot of that wood for England to become such a great superpower around the world. Another use for our forests was for making fuel that was then used to melt iron ore in the iron industries of Pennsylvania. And the iron industries were largely in the southern half of the state and stretched all the way across the state over time. And it came up into the central regions of the state. Initially, the iron industry was critical for the Revolutionary War effort, but from then on, it was, a major part of the U.S. industry was the production of charcoal iron. And charcoal iron means the iron that was smelted down, the ore that was smelted down using charcoal as the fuel. So instead of fuel oil or gas, they were actually burning charcoal that had been produced in forests and then hauled to the iron furnaces. And that's the fuel that gets hot enough to melt iron ore. I was making some charcoal recently myself, and we measured the temperature at 1700 degrees. Charcoal can go even higher, but 1700 is pretty hot, and it's getting hot enough to melt stone, iron ore. This was in Curtin, Pennsylvania, one of the very last iron furnaces that was still operating around 1920. Okay, this is the charcoal. That's what it looked like. That was the fuel source that was used in iron furnaces, and it was made from wood. Another big industry in Pennsylvania was the lumber industry, and this was, of course, important all across the state. Lumber was needed, but in particular, as a large industry, it was in the northern half of Pennsylvania and down into the center a little bit as well. And those forests in the northern area had not been used for agriculture yet, and they were cleared to produce lumber and all types of wood products, kind of raw wood products, so to speak. And they were shipped out of those areas generally on water, on the riverways, which I'll show you here in a minute. But many of us can trace our ancestry back to some of these people that came to work in the forest here. Many of them were Northern Europeans like Swedes and Dutch and Danish and what's the other one there? Norwegians. And, lots of times in Poland, lots of times they came from those countries and they couldn't speak any English, but they found good work in the lumber camps of northern Pennsylvania. They used all sorts of tricks to get wood moved around. There were no roads and trucks at that time. So here's a log slide coming down the mountain, and they would actually ice this up in the winter months. So they'd run water over it or wet it down, and the logs would slide all the way down the hillside to get down to the river. Here's what it looked like on the rivers in Pennsylvania: the Susquehanna, the Allegheny River, the Delaware River, and a few others, the West Branch, that were used to transport lumber. Sometimes that lumber was squared, like you can see here with this large raft, these huge rafts. Sometimes it was actually sawed down a little bit more into beams and things like that. But these were big, big lumber rafts that were floated down the river, rafted down the river, and went as far as, like on the Susquehanna, down into Baltimore area, to the big markets, along the Delaware, of course, to Philadelphia, and along the Allegheny down to Pittsburgh, and even all the way down to New Orleans, and all along the way. Our lumber went out of Pennsylvania on rivers like this, and these huge rafts were the way it was moved. Now, this is what it would have looked like, and I think this was taken around 1860 near Williamsport. But if you look back towards the back part of this picture, you see all those logs and all that wood there in the river. And each of these logs would have been branded, so they knew who's going to get paid for those logs. That made it to different sawmills down along the rivers, down at Williamsport and down below there. You can see the huge kind of pile-ups of logs, and men like this were out there picking these things apart. It was very dangerous work. You can imagine if you fell down between a couple of these logs, you would be crushed. And they used long poles called pikes and different types of hooks and things to move logs around to keep it flowing along there. And there would be booms in the river, and booms were like large chains that went from like a wooden crib of stone and wood, to another one, to another one, to another one, sort of like a flotation device to keep the logs from going down river. When logging railroads were introduced into Pennsylvania, this is in the early 1880s, a little bit before that, there were a lot of temporary railroads that were constructed up into the hills and across the hilltops of Pennsylvania, in the northern parts, in the eastern all across northern Pennsylvania, and even down here, like State College and south of here, they were using logging railroads. These were quite different. They had very small or narrow gauges, so the tracks weren't that far apart on these ties that were temporarily thrown down. I like to think of some kind of amusement park railroad almost sometimes, that the locomotives could have been very, very small sometimes. Now this one doesn't look that small, but I imagine that track there is probably something like 18 inches apart. And this railroad would have been built, and then they would have logged off an area, and then they tear up those tracks and they go to another area. These did not last in the woods. These were not just left in the woods. They were too valuable for that. You can see this little trestle that was built across the river here. There was a lot of temporary construction. And those logs on there, obviously, those aren't for lumber. Those are probably going as railroad props to some mine area. Here's something that might have gone for lumber here, and these look like they were hemlock logs after the bark had been peeled off of them. This is down in Bedford County, and this is one of these temporary railroads that was put in the woods, and of course is no longer there after a few years. Even the grade, and the the land in this area was very temporarily leveled off, and sometimes you can find these old grades today in the woods, but sometimes they're kind of been incorporated back into the forest, so it's just maybe a little trail through the woods. The use of bark was very important in Pennsylvania, especially in regards to tanning leather. Leather was coming from the west, from cattle ranchers and cattle farms, and buffalo. All the buffalo that were slaughtered in the west, many of their hides were coming to Pennsylvania for tanning. And then the big stockyards in places like Chicago, where they were butchering meat, cattle that were brought up there either on trains or driven there by cowboys from, out in the western areas. Those hides were coming to places like Pennsylvania where they were tanned. I used to live near Sheffield, Pennsylvania, and it blows my mind to think that in Sheffield, Pennsylvania, which is a small town up in Warren County, it's about 13 miles east of Warren, the largest corporation in the United States at that time was the American Leather Company, I think it was called, and they were tanning leather right there. And this was the Amazon or the Google of its day, and their business was leather tanning. And a lot of that was going to the Civil War effort and other uses of leather. A big use of leather was for belts and belting and machinery and things like that. So the Industrial Revolution needed that leather for a variety of other things besides just our boots and belts and shoes and things like that. When wood was used to make, or when bark was taken off hemlock logs, lots of times people think that these logs were just left to lay in the woods, when in fact they weren't generally. They were left there for a while, but then they would be later picked up for use to make lumber, hemlock lumber, and oak was also used by some of the tanneries too, its bark. But look at the narrow gauge on this railroad here. That's not more than 18 inches, I don't think. And you can see how temporary those ties are. They're just rounded. They weren't squared up or anything. This very much looks like an amusement park kind of railroad, at least to me. And it's kind of fun to think about how they could haul wood out on these little temporary railroads. Whoops, I went backwards there. Okay, and one of the last big industries to be using our forests during the industrial era, or the early industrial era in particular, was the wood chemical industry. So wood was used to produce alcohols and acetate and acetone and all kinds of chemicals all the way up until the Second World War, and still is in some areas of the United States. I don't think we have too many wood chemical industries left here in Pennsylvania. But the kind of dramatic thing to realize is that this industry didn't need logs that were big enough to make lumber out of. It could use just about any size of tree, any size of wood. So any area that had been cut over extensively for lumber or agriculture or other uses or props and things like that, they then would go in, the chemical wood industry, go in and clear the rest. So all of our forests were largely clear cut by 1920 in Pennsylvania. So to say that our forests today are the same forests that have always been here is sort of an error because, in fact, our forests, with the exception of about 0.0001%, have all been cut at least once, usually 2 or 3 times, and then grown back since European settlement. This picture was near Ridgeway, Pennsylvania. All right, mine props were a big use of our forest too, and this is the wood that went underground and stayed underground. So you can see the use of timbers here in mines, and they had railroads underground too, small railroads. And a lot of this wood is still there today. You know, it hasn't rotted away. It's, at least if some of these mines are still accessible and open, that wood is underground down there. It's kind of a surprise to people to think how much wood went underground, but huge quantities of trees and woods and trunks of trees were used. And the wood that was cut into lumber went to build our cities, places like Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Scranton, and such needed wood. These stick construction type buildings were the way things were being built at that time. And so much of our wood was going into these buildings, whereas today we don't use our wood for construction purposes very much. We use it for other things, which we'll talk about later. But back then, a lot of this wood was used in construction to build and expand cities and urban areas. Much of Pennsylvania looked like this after it was cut. Many areas after it was cut were burned so that they could produce berries and to drive out wolves and other animals that were still lingering in some areas. This is Mount Pocono in eastern Pennsylvania. But it could be anywhere on just about any mountain I can think of in Pennsylvania. Mount Nittany looked just like this. It didn't have a road up top that I remember, but it was completely cleared. If you've ever been to Penn State and look at Mount Nittany today, it's totally covered with forest. But every forest was cut over. And in this case, in Mount Nittany, what you're looking at there on the ground looks like it probably was a lot of berry bushes, but it could be young trees, seedlings coming in, mixed into those berry bushes as well. So those trees naturally regenerated across Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about that too today, but they didn't get planted. There were some attempts to replant our forests during the Depression era, but for the most part, all of the forests that regrew, reestablished in Pennsylvania came back naturally. That's another myth that many students believe, and teachers as well, believe that the CCC and other groups replanted our forests, but they didn't. The main reason why we could get these forests to grow back was because there was a lot of sun, there were not a lot of deer eating up the young seedlings, and fire was being suppressed. So they were getting people to stop burning so much and let the young trees grow. Today, when you go into Penn's woods, into the forest, you see some signs of this past history. This is an old iron furnace in the woods. There's many of these old furnaces. Maybe you've seen them before. This was Monroe Furnace. It went out of business in 1845, but they sold their land, 17,000 acres, to another furnace that kept going till about 1910. There are graves in the woods. You know, there were various bouts of influenza and other things that took the lives of the people that worked in the woods, and their graves were often, hastily constructed. They weren't engraved stone. The markers weren't, and we don't know who's buried in some of these spots today. But today, about 20% of Pennsylvania is agriculture land, which was all cleared from forests. It wasn't anything really else originally. It was forest. About 20% is developed land in Pennsylvania. So that means places like towns and cities and roads and industrial areas. And about 60% is forested. So it's still, we went from about 95% forest back in the day, pre-European settlement. We now have 60%. So we got down to 25% or so, 30%, and we're back up to 60 now as we've let areas grow back into forest land. The green area you see on this digital aerial type image or information image, the green is all forest. The white is all open areas like agriculture. And of course, the red are urban areas, and the blue, where you see that, is water. 70% of that area, the 60% of Pennsylvania that is forested, 70% is owned by private individuals. That means people like you and I, and it doesn't mean industry. It used to largely be owned by the industries, at least the bigger portions, but now it's just owned by individual families. We used to say that 1 out of every 9 families own forest land in Pennsylvania when I first started work 30 plus years ago. Now we say 1 out of every 7. So there are a lot more forest landowners, about 800,000 people owning forest land in Pennsylvania. And 30% is public ownership. This doesn't show the little section that's owned by the government. I guess that's probably part of the public ownership, but you also have some big corporations and other entities in this public ownership. So public ownership would be your state, federal, and local governments, but it would also include nonprofits and things like that. The private ownership would be just regular old folks like us. We have some history that's in the making today. You'll hear about some of this. A lot of it is around invasive insects, and how they're impacting our forests. Some of it is about too many deer in some areas. Some of it is about parcelization of forests. That means the breaking up of large pieces of land into smaller pieces. And that's why we have more people on forest land today. We like to educate people about poor harvesting practices and how to do it right when you're going to have timber cut. Air pollution and acid rain are still issues in some areas in particular. Diseases from other countries. Shale gas extraction has its impacts on our forests, especially where they clear pads and roads and pipelines and things like that. And then deforestation due to, and I put my thing here right over, development. Okay, so we do lose quite a bit of forest each year to deforestation. Fortunately, we let some lands revert back into forests, so it kind of offsets some of that. All right, and let's see if there we go. So that's me sleeping in the woods. All right, so we have about 3 minutes to go, and I don't have too much time for questions, but Cassidy, is there any burning question there that I need to answer?
We don't have any right now. If anyone has a quick question, might want to type it quickly.
Yeah, and it's fine if you don't. I went very quickly. I really wanted to give you like a quick taste of the history of our forests, and the history impacts what we have today. The way it was cut, the way the land is, the way it was treated in the past, kind of can help us predict pretty well what's going to be there and what's going to be there in the future if some kind of activity is done there, whether it's cutting or clearing or some kind of insect outbreak. We kind of know what will come in place naturally in that area. And sometimes it's not native things, and that can be a problem. Okay. I hope that if I did anything, I dispelled a few maybe myths that people believe this morning with this short talk, but we're happy to share these slides with you. We're happy to talk to you, even talk to a group. If you want to have the teachers in your school district, attend a quick program like this, we'd be happy to do that. We believe that you are really the most important audience we can work with because you impact the future through your work with kids. And we just want to strengthen you and support you in the work that you do. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dave, and let him talk, and I'll even probably hide myself here. I'm going to stop my share there, Dave, so you're up, and I will disappear into a background.
All right, thank you, Sandy. Yep, great job as usual. Always interesting for me to see that presentation as many times as I have, but interesting to see and learn about our history. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. This is called Pennsylvania's Forests and Forestry. And I want to make this interactive if we can. So we've sat through a half an hour here. I pose a lot of questions in this presentation. The first few I will answer myself because the answers are kind of long and drawn out, but through the remainder of it, I will try to get you to use the chat, maybe, short answers, one word kinds of answers that you can type in there quickly. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time, but we'll try to get this interactive and get you thinking and get you moving a little bit here. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is the first question that I'll pose to you. I think it's important that we set the stage here with some definitions and really get you thinking about what we're talking about here. So what is a forest? So what is a forest? So think about that for a minute here. But a forest is much more than just the trees that we typically think of. So it is a land area characterized by extensive tree cover, of course, but it also includes all of its associated resources, meadows, water, all the wildlife and other plants that are also found there. So it's more than just the trees. It includes all the other natural resources that we find in forest. And you can see some of those here. Here's a meadow that you can see down in the foreground here. They come in a number of different names. So oftentimes we don't call them a forest because that's what people think of as very large acreage areas. But when we think about smaller parcels that private landowners might own, we might call them the woods or woodland or even a woodlot or forest land. So we can use different names. And then there's different types. We might have a natural forest, and Sandy talked about how our forest came back naturally versus a plantation. If we were to go down south where I worked, we would see lots of southern pine plantations that were all established through planting those trees, or even out west. And then we can have old growth forests, so areas that were never harvested. As Sandy mentioned, a very small fraction of our forests in Pennsylvania. And then we even talked today about our urban forests, where we have trees that are associated with cities and towns and communities. And then of course, the ownership is very different. As Sandy pointed out, we can have private individuals like you and I owning that land. We can have industrial companies like sawmills and paper mills own that land. Of course, much of those folks have sold their land off now, and a lot of it is now in investment companies' hands. And then the public ownership. In Pennsylvania, we're blessed with a lot of public ownership, from our state forests to our state game lands to our national forests. So the next question is, what is forestry then? So we know what a forest is, but what is forestry? So what is forestry? So forestry is a profession that applies a science to the practice of creating, managing, using, and conserving forests for human benefit. So we're going to use these forests, we're going to manage forests for our benefit, but we're going to do it in a sustainable manner that's going to meet our different goals, needs, objectives, values, things like that. So it's the science. And I think it's important that you understand that it is a science. There's a huge foundation of research that is behind the science of forestry. So when we practice forestry, we're practicing it based on research and based on the science, but we also do it in a way to meet a variety of goals, needs, and values. And we'll define sustainable here later, a little bit later on in the presentation. We want to make sure to point out the difference between conservation versus preservation. And when we practice forestry, we're practicing conservation or wise use of the resource, versus preservation is basically preserving that resource, not utilizing that resource, setting that resource aside. But with conservation, we're using it wisely. We're protecting soil, water, wildlife, those other resources that are found in the forest. And we wanted you to think of forestry as agriculture, and wood is the crop of forestry. So we're going to practice forestry so that we can produce a crop, and that crop is the wood that those trees produce. So the last one that I'm going to give you the answer for is, what is a forester? And I know when I was growing up and I told my family members that I wanted to be a forester, the first thing that comes to mind was that you're going to be a park ranger, or you're going to sit in a fire tower, or be a firefighter out in the woods. And that's really not the case of what a forester is. So let's give you the definition here. So the first thing that you need to understand, that is a profession. So this is a profession that is engaged in that science of forestry. So that managing that wise use, that conservation of forest resources. They do require a formal education. So typically our forestry professionals have a 4-year degree. You can be a technician with a 2-year degree. And there are many different types of foresters. We give them names like an industry forester that would work for a mill, like a paper mill or a sawmill. Service foresters, those are typically state employed foresters that work for, in our case, the Bureau of Forestry. We have private consulting foresters that have their own private companies, their own private businesses. Research foresters like we have with the U.S. Forest Service and with universities. And then like myself, working with Extension, I like to call us the information and education foresters. So we have folks in lots of different realms that are foresters, they're professionals, and they're practicing the science of forestry. So this is where you come in now. So if you can get your chat open there, and I will do the same here. So what is a tree? So we know what a forest is, and forestry and foresters, but what is a tree? What is a characteristic that actually defines what these are? So how do we do this as a definition? And I think as we go through some of these things, think about all of these questions that I'm posing to you, that they can be integral in different lesson plans that you might be able to utilize in your classroom as well. Oh, there's an interesting, yeah, there you go. Oh, there you go. Plant with a woody stem or trunk, yeah. Leaf stock, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, and there's the height criteria. So the 25 feet. So yeah, so a lot of those are what we're looking for here. So here, a long-lived woody perennial plant with one trunk and a mature height of at least 13 feet. So yeah, a lot of you nailed some of those things. So long-lived, a lot of our trees in Pennsylvania can grow 400, 500 years of age. So long-lived. Yep, and there's the perennial plant, very good. One trunk, and then that height criteria is what distinguishes it from a shrub. So shrub we typically think of as having, it's also woody and perennial, but it will have multiple trunks or stems, and at mature height won't grow as tall as a tree. So that's the difference there. I like to think of them as being in two broad categories, hardwoods versus softwoods. And these aren't opposites here, as you see that, because we think of our hardwoods as these broadleaf deciduous trees, and that's a great term to define with students. What does it mean to be deciduous? Because most of our trees are deciduous. It means they lose their leaves in the wintertime. But softwoods are typically our conifers, and these are cone-bearing trees. Typically, they're evergreens, but again, not all of them are evergreen, but they do bear cones, and those are our pines, our spruces, our fir, hemlock, cedar trees, things like that. So the hardwood, softwood is a little bit of a misnomer, because we can have broadleaf deciduous trees with very soft wood, like poplars, for example, or we can have conifers or softwoods, a very dense and hardwood, like a yew, for example. So that's a little misleading, but certainly understanding conifer and deciduous is a really important terminology. All right, next question. How many different types of trees are found in the state of Pennsylvania? Yeah, I see, Cassidy, maybe you can help Kimberly there. Sounds like she's having some difficulty seeing what's being posted there. Oh, I just gave it away. Jeez. I don't know if people saw that or not. Let's see if you can, if you didn't see it. Yeah, somebody nailed it.
I'm just going to cut in quick and remind everyone to make sure your drop down says all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, other people cannot see your answers.
Yeah, exactly. That could be the issue. Yep. So yeah, so there's 134, but then in addition to that, those are just our native trees. And then there's another 62 that are introduced. So yeah, I see some of the answers there. Good. So this is always a great activity, certainly tree identification. I would encourage you to do that in the fall, so that you do have leaves on the trees. it's quite challenging to learn to identify trees by bark and bud and twigs, but it can be done once you get some of them down and you're used to looking at them. But you know, Sandy has a great resource too, where we talk about 10 important hardwoods in Pennsylvania. So limiting the number and the expectation of your students on tree ideas is a good way to start, because it can be quite overwhelming when you start looking at the full gamut here. Here you go. Next question. What do trees need to grow now? So maybe just give me one answer here, and we'll see if we get all of them that I put on here. So the soil, sunlight, water, and space. Yeah, good. I think those are the ones I was looking for. I'm surprised somebody got the space one there, because that's, yeah, and of course they give off the oxygen, but their roots do need oxygen, and they take in the carbon dioxide. But I like to just list light, water, nutrients, which they get from the soil, and then space, because trees need to be able to expand their crowns. And we'll talk about how trees grow here in a minute, because if they can't expand their crowns, they're going to decline, and they may ultimately decline to the point where they don't survive. So how do trees grow? And so trees grow in, I'm going to give you this one. Trees grow in two ways. So they grow out and they grow up. And so they grow out by producing growth rings. Yep. And from terminal buds is how they grow up. And so they'll set a bud at the end. Well, and Gary's pointing right here. So that was where a bud was at one time. That shoot elongated to there, and you can actually see those bud scale scars on those twigs. And so that's how they elongate those shoots, and that's how they have to, that's how they require that space to be able to get larger. But annual growth rings, they put on a light and a dark ring each year. So the spring wood is typically lighter in color, and then the summer wood or the late wood is typically darker in color. So that's the growth rings. And of course, you can get into a lot of the different components of wood with the xylem and the cambium and the phloem, and what the functions are of all those kinds of things, the inner bark and outer bark, etc. So lots of science that you can investigate with kids there. Here you go. True or false question, easy one. So do different diameter trees equal different age trees? True or false? Different diameter trees, and you can see two different ones here. We have this small tree and this very large tree. Majority of you getting it there with the false. Yeah, very good. So yeah, it is false. Both of these trees were about 70 years old, and think back to what trees need to grow. And typically in Pennsylvania, that space and that light are the limiting factors. Normally we have enough nutrients, and we have the rainfall that trees require, unlike out west. So yeah, that's false. So if I'm not getting light and I'm not getting space, I can grow very, very slowly, like that hemlock tree did there versus that ash that you see with that larger one. All right, real quick here. One of the things we like to talk about a lot are what some of the benefits that we get from trees and forests. So can you think about what some of the things that we get from trees? And we've kind of alluded to some of these already, but what are some of the benefits? What are some of the good things that we get as a result of having trees in our communities, trees in our forested areas? Yeah, shelter, oxygen, food, somebody got recreation even, cool. Oxygen, yeah, the whole clean air concept. Yeah, jobs, there you go. I didn't even put that one down. So yeah, very good. Biodiversity, yep. Yeah, so here's just a short list. A lot of talk now about carbon sequestration and some of the things that we're trying to implement around our green energy. So that's a biggie today. And I think it's interesting, I looked at some of those products, and what really came to my mind in Sandy's presentation there was all those mine props still underground. Those are all still sequestering that carbon that was in those trees. And so that's an interesting way that we can cut trees down. We can turn them into products that can last for hundreds of years, sequestering that carbon, and we can grow new trees back at the same time and sequester more carbon. But yeah, that's the clean water there, stabilizing soil. You know, most of our forested watersheds are where a lot of cities and towns are getting their water supplies from. But a lot of you hit some of these other ones, the shade, the windbreaks, the recreation, aesthetics, all those kinds of things. How do we use trees? How do we use trees? So this really gets to the product side of things. So what are some of the products that we would make from our Pennsylvania hardwood trees? Yeah, furniture, absolutely. So think about the majority of the trees in Pennsylvania veneer. Majority of our trees in Pennsylvania are broadleaf deciduous trees, those hardwood trees. And what are the majority of the products that are made from those kinds of trees? And you hit upon a good one there, was the furniture. But look around you in your home, if you're sitting in your home or in your office, and what do you see that would be made from a hardwood species? A maple, a cherry, an oak. Yeah, flooring and trim. Yep, there you go. There you go. Cabinetry. Awesome. Yep. So here's just a brief overview. So yeah, the majority of our trees, our hardwood trees, our broadleaf deciduous trees are made into these kinds of products. The furniture and furniture parts, where you see that might be covered with fabric, but the underlayment of it could be a hardwood, lower quality, typically cabinetry, molding, flooring. You know, I have hardwood floors right here in my home office. And I have, you know, cabinetry and a desk that's wooden, that's made out of hardwood broadleaf deciduous trees. So this is where the majority of our products are going. And here's a, you know, question, you know, do we have to cut trees to use them? So think about that for a minute. Do we have to cut trees to use them? Well, certainly to make all of these products, we do. But yeah, the answer is no, because there are some other products that we get from trees and other benefits that we get from trees where they aren't harvested. And think of some of the food products, for example, like tapping trees for maple syrup, for example. So that's certainly one use of trees. Yep, nuts and fruit, things like that, absolutely. But what about this question? Is it okay to cut or harvest trees to use them for all those products that we have in our homes? And this is a great question to talk to your kids about, your students about. If it's sustainable, yes, sustainably, yes, responsibly, yeah, awesome. So you guys are right on track. And so yes, if we practice sustainable forestry, and a lot of key to sustainable forestry is being able to keep forests as forests and keep them working. And so when we lose forest land, we lose this ability to provide these products sustainably. But here's the definition that I like to use for sustainable forestry. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're only going to take a few at a time, spread over it, because we can take all the trees off a certain area, but it means that we're going to do it in a way that allows us to meet our needs today for all of the things that we use those trees for, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to do the same thing. It doesn't compromise their ability to meet their own needs. So how old are most trees in Pennsylvania's forest when they're ready for harvest? You know, you guys are learning a lot about agriculture. And typically agricultural crops are 1 year, right? They need one growing season and then they're harvested. So what about our tree crop there? What do you think? How old are they when they're typically ready for harvest? 20, 40, 15 to 20. Yeah, interesting. So probably the 35 to 50 is if we're down in the southern parts of the United States, maybe 15 to 20, even for paper crops. But typically when we're talking, our hardwood saw timber trees to make furniture, flooring, cabinetry, those kind of things, we're at 80 to 100 years to get trees to that 18 to 20 inch diameter. That's what we call the rotation age. So at that age, we're ready to start that rotation over again, harvest those trees and grow a new crop. And we can age trees. We can count rings on the stump like you see in this image here, or we can use an increment borer. So there's a tool that this cores into the tree, and you can take out a wood core, like a pencil-sized piece of wood, and actually count the growth rings on it. So a couple neat ways to teach kids about tree growth and age and such. So are trees and forests a renewable resource? So the answer is yes, absolutely. So yes, they can be replaced in our lifetime. So it's a renewable resource. It's a renewable natural resource. And these are images of a couple of my landowners standing in a young forest, a forest where they harvested the crop and are growing the next one now. So how are Pennsylvania forests renewed? And I'm going to give you this one in the interest of time, through natural reforest regeneration. So Sandy talked about this. So the growth of a new forest from seedling and sprouts is what we call regeneration. So forests regenerate. They grow back from seedlings and sprouts. Seedlings, stump sprouts, root sprouts, depending on the species. Many of our cut hardwood trees will sprout from the stump after they're harvested, but most of our trees come back from seeds, from acorns and nuts and things like that that drop on the forest floor. So here's an image we would have shown you out in the woods at our demonstration woodlot. This area was harvested 2012 and 2019, same exact site. Look at this tree right here. You can see it right there. 7 growing seasons later, you can see how the new growth, new forest, young forest has grown in. We're ready to remove the remaining crop trees there and grow this new young forest. So that's what we call forest succession. So the natural change in plant cover over time in the absence of disturbance, going from this cutover area to this in that 80 to 100 year rotation. And then I always like to pose this question to folks: do different age forests provide habitat for different species of wildlife? What do you think? Do all wildlife species need mature forests? Yeah, so that's right. It is yes. Do different age forests provide habitat for different species of wildlife? Yes. So wildlife need a diversity of habitats because different species do require different stages of succession in order to thrive. And we can see a bobwhite quail out here, the ruffed grouse and the white-tailed deer, the turkey, the squirrel, the pileated woodpecker, in these more mature forests. And there's a whole suite of species that you would find in these different ages. So by having diversity on the landscape, we can provide for a broader biodiversity of species. The last thing, I've got about 6 minutes here. We're going to run through a series of 10 slides very quickly that were taken up on the Allegheny National Forest area. They started in 1928, I believe it was, and then photographed that same spot every 10 years. We're going to show you how the forest is renewable, how forest succession grows, and what it looks like through these images. And so here it was in 1928, and Sandy mentioned to you the chemical wood industry, and you can see a stack of smaller trees right here. All the large saw timber trees had already been removed, and now they came back and they harvested that chemical wood. So this area was completely harvested. But one thing to note, you can see lots of young seedlings growing here, just literally thousands to the acre. 1928, very few deer. So our forest readily grew back naturally. Nothing was planted here. And here it is in 1937, 10 years later, you can start to see it's so dense and shaded on the understory here that no new seedlings are establishing. Tremendous competition for light and resources. These trees are trying to get above their neighbor. You may have 20, 30,000 stems to the acre, almost a tree every square foot in naturally regenerating areas. So here it is in 1947, 20 years of age, and we can start to pick out some species. We have a couple black cherries and a sugar maple. Looks like it might be a stump sprout. They're coming off the same spot here. We're going to follow these trees. Here they are, 30 years of age. One thing that's really important, we have an aspen now in this one, but one thing that's really important to note is that all of these trees are essentially the same age. They all came in following that harvest in 1928. So give or take a couple years, these trees are essentially the same age. We call that an even aged forest. Let's follow these trees. And the other thing to note is that there's tremendous competition, as I said, and you're going to see the mortality that occurs just through the natural thinning process of these trees competing with each other. And you can see dead trees all throughout all of these images as they eventually drop out and others survive. So here it is, 40 years of age. These black cherry trees are exactly the same age, but note how much bigger this one is. It obviously has more crown area up there in the sunlight. Sugar maple's kind of hanging on. Here's the aspen in the background, but note the sugar maple leaves in the understory, very shade tolerant species. The black cherry would be way up in the canopy, very intolerant of shade. Here it is, 1978, 50 years later. There must have been a big storm because here's a big broken branch from a cherry nearby. It took the top out of this aspen tree. So now there's a big opening up in the canopy up here, and you're going to see this black cherry tree now has an opportunity to expand its crown into that area that was created. So here's the aspen now. It's just a snag, just a standing dead tree right here. The black cherry now is actually getting quite a bit larger. I'm going to show you something that's kind of neat. Let me go back. So note this branch right here. It must have stuck in the ground after that storm. But here it is 10 years later. It's still a remnant of it, still hanging on. But there's the aspen. The sugar maples are happy as can be underneath the black cherry, but this one really starting to expand into that opening. Here it is at age 70. Almost the same size now. Sugar maple is not a whole lot of change there. And then here it is 80 years out. We actually have one side of that sugar maple die off. Now you can see the bark is missing. This tree moved into the image here somehow, so a little bit different angle. And there's our two black cherry trees. And then 90 years of age, I think what happened here was they actually built a road nearby here for a gas line, and it brought some sunlight in. And you can see the understory with that sunlight coming in has now just exploded. So there it is, 90 years of age. So let's just do something here really quick here. I'm just gonna back up and I'm gonna just walk you through it really quickly so you can kind of see every 10 years how the forest changes, how forest succession occurs over this 90 years. And you can see how the forest changes 70 years, 80 years, and 90 years of age. So that's the last image that we have taken in 2018. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm going to let Sandy come on and we'll wrap things up. And then what we'll do is we will answer any questions that people might have at the end there. So we should have some time. I think we left about 10, 15 minutes or so for questions. So that's Sandy, it's all yours.
All right. Dave, I just wanted to make a couple comments that I wrote down, and maybe first a question for you. What's sequester mean? You talk about sequester carbon. What is it? What are you talking about there?
Yes, that's a good point. So yeah, so sequester carbons means to take it out of the atmosphere and store it in our trees. If we're sequestering carbon, we're removing it from the atmosphere and we're going to store it. And we can store it in trees as they stand in the forest, or we can store it in products in our home.
And when Dave says we do that, it's actually the tree that takes the carbon dioxide out of the air and takes the carbon out of that and then stores it so that it's not a form of pollution anymore.
It's part of the process of photosynthesis. That's how trees make wood.
Yeah, and you'll hear a lot these days about how trees are the answer for a lot of our global warming and pollution problems, and that's the connection there, that they're capturing carbon and holding it. Okay, another one is, it's sort of counterintuitive to think we use our wood for the very high-end things, veneer and furniture, but why are we making paper out of it?
Is that a question for me or for the group?
For you.
So we are typically what we're making paper out of are the smaller trees or the tops of trees or the poor quality or lower valued species. And honestly, we don't make a lot of paper in Pennsylvania anymore. A lot of our paper mills are shuttering their doors. So yeah, we used to make a lot of paper in our state, but we're down, I think, just a handful of mills now, not even a handful.
Yeah, I'll just emphasize that, paper is made from the tiny fibers in wood, and you can use almost any wood to make paper, the scraps. But the highest quality papers, it depends upon the species and such. But I just wanted to clarify that, because we talk about this all the time. Like, we do make paper in Pennsylvania, but it's really the junk or scrap wood we're using, not the good wood that we want to use for high-end kind of uses, the more expensive.
That's a good point. And the high-end, that stuff's going into our furniture and cabinetry and flooring and such. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, and then lastly, I noticed that some people still were thinking that we can replant or replace trees. We don't do that. That happens naturally. And if we leave you with anything today, we just want you to know, we call that natural regeneration, where the forest naturally comes back in, just like that group of pictures that you just saw showed you. Nobody went out there and planted those trees. They come in from the roots and the seeds and the stump sprouts and things like that. And thank goodness for that, because it would be hard to plant a forest that thick to produce the good straight trees.
And I noticed some folks are typing in the chat some questions. So I might encourage you to use the Q&A so that Cassidy can just monitor the Q&A at the end. So if you do have a question that you want read and answered by us at the end, I would encourage you to type that into the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, David. Just wanted to bug you about things, but also hope to clarify things for people. And here we go. Well, let's see here. Here we are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching, and I hope you got to watch a short video that I had done on connecting youth with nature. And I use the term nature broadly. I think people identify with it more than forestry or forest sometimes. And you heard some of the things that I like to share with people about the fact that, we all kind of get a love and appreciation for forests when we're young, and that adults, parents in particular, are critical in this process, but so are teachers. So let's look at some curriculum resources for teaching youth about forests and forestry, and this includes wildlife. Foresters tend to always include wildlife when it comes to forestry. We love it, and that's what we're about. So let me just make sure I've got that thing out of the way, and okay. Whoops. All right, so you know better than I do that today's youth spend the majority of their free time connected indoors, right? We've heard plenty about low bandwidth and lack of internet connection in the last year in particular, but still kids are getting where they can be connected, be it in a home or a restaurant or a library or a school. And this is really how they spend a lot of their free time, as well as school time. Also, a lack of knowledge and understanding about forests and forest resources is very common these days. We find that kids have less and less exposure to natural habitat, natural ecosystems, just because they only have so much free time and they're indoors a lot. And lastly, that youth sometimes have some misconceptions and fears about the outdoors. And this isn't just true with youth, it's true with adults too, that many people have grown up in a way that they didn't get much exposure to the outdoors and forests. And so they have some misconceptions, some fears sometimes, but just a lack of knowledge. So it's really a state of being almost these days. It's the status report, I guess, I've given here. And I keep having an issue with advancing. Okay, some of you have heard of a book called Last Child in the Woods. This is about 13 years old now, written by a man named Richard Louv, who really gathered together a lot of research and a lot of experiential information that people had related to this disconnection that youth have with the natural world, and but also adults now too, because many of the kids that have grown up during times when they didn't spend a lot of time outside and such are now adults. He coined the term nature deficit disorder, and that's not a medical condition. It's just sort of a term that's used to describe the many different psychological and physical effects of not spending time outdoors and not being active and interacting really outside, and as well as exercising and breathing fresh air and things like that. So this book's been around a while. It's a great read. It's been updated. I highly recommend it. It will probably change your view on some things, and it will be for the better. Research says that almost everyone who has a love and appreciation of nature is mentored, and it's been planted by an adult in their life. It doesn't just happen. It takes some coaching and mentoring about love and appreciation. It's instilled early. So if you're an early education elementary ed teacher, this is something that you play a big role in, but also middle school, high school teachers as well can have quite an influence on kids. Again, parents and grandparents are really the main player here, but it doesn't mean that you and your time with kids can't really do a lot to further their interest in the outdoors. And it's often connected to a specific place. So if your family had a farm or a kind of a park nearby or a private piece of land, some kind of a natural area that you spent regular time in, this is shown to be so critical for forming that bond with the land. But it can be just a backyard. It can be an empty, I say empty, but an open piece of land near someone's home that they just spend a lot of time in as a child. This can also be formative in the development of that child. We have some resources, and some of these are ones that you may have heard of, but if you have, please bear with us, because there probably be something else you haven't heard of. One is Teach for Forests, and this is an online course for educators like yourself, and it's from Penn State Cooperative Extension. In the last year, in the COVID year, we had something in the neighborhood of 3,000, 4,000 teachers take this course. They had time. We also gave it free for about 3 months, and so that helped to get our numbers up. Now it's at half price, so it's only $50. So if you have a school district that helps to pay for professional development activities, you may want to do this. This is about a 10-hour course online, and it expands on all these things that Dave and I have been talking about today, about forests and forestry in Pennsylvania, wildlife, and we also cover water and things in more depth than this quick session you've had today. And you complete it at your own leisure, at your own schedule, and Act 48 credits are available for when you take that course, so it does kind of help meet your requirement if you have the need for that. 4-H program has lots of natural resources education curriculum, and this is free to students. For a class to work with 4-H, I think there's a $20 fee, and some counties cover it with the money they raise in different ways, but it's relatively small. But the curriculum materials are tremendous, and they're very Pennsylvania specific. So Pennsylvania's 4-H curriculum can be accessed through your county 4-H educator. In every county, there's one, If you don't know who that is, I can tell you who it is. You can send me a note. And some of the other information is here, but we have materials related to just about everything. But in these specific topics, we have lots of wildlife materials, forestry, water are the big ones in this kind of curriculum area, though. We have a little project called the Future Forest Steward Project, and this gets kids to think about if they owned a piece of land and how they would manage it or how they would care for it. It's the 3rd through 6th grade level reading level, and there's also a patch that the students will get. And any teacher that ever works with us in this, we send the material to you for free, and the teachers love it, and almost everybody repeats. We have a high recidivism rate, I guess you might say. And we still have these materials. We're happy to get them to you. And again, that would be contacting Dave or I, and we will have them mailed to you. We have a series of publications which you have links to called the Environment and Ecology series. It's 3rd through 4th grade level, and it dealt with the state environment and ecology standards, and which are still in force, though there's an attempt to get rid of them right now, but we're hoping that that won't happen. And there's one on ecosystems, one on renewable and non-renewable resources, one on wetlands and watersheds, and one on threatened and endangered wildlife. So these are Pennsylvania kids level and at that 3rd and 4th grade reading level and content, subject matter. We also have a series called From the Woods, and a lot of teachers will use this for 4th and 5th grade. When we wrote it, we thought it would be for the 6th through 8th grade level, but still it's used. You have a link to each of these, and you can download the digital version of the flyer. You could print out what you need. You can get hard copy versions, and I think they'll give one to you of each of these, but when I say they, I mean Penn State Extension. And there are lesson plans online and quizzes, and I think we gave you a link to all of those too. So they're in that digital folder that was provided to you. We tried to prevent dumping a whole load on you, but we did give you the connections if you want them. Let me say a few words about Project Wild and Project Learning Tree, if you've heard of these before. They are still really the best national curricula related to forestry and wildlife. We wholeheartedly encourage and support them. Project Learning Tree has been around for maybe 25 to 30 years now, and Project Wild maybe 35 years. It used to be you had to attend a workshop to get their materials, but now Project Learning Tree materials have been just updated. They're just available, a new version this summer called Explore Your Environment, and you can purchase this book. And then you can watch an online training. You don't have to attend a big long training. You can watch an online training, or you can just go ahead and use it. And same, Project Wild still requires a training, but you can purchase many of their materials online. And but I think they still do like to do a 6-hour workshop, and the Game Commission often does these, as well as the Department of Education. And these are mostly used in schools and nature centers, and they are books of lessons galore and ones that have been very seriously field tested. So if you ask me, as a formal school teacher, what might be the best curriculum to get if you're only going to get one, these are probably the two things that I would say you ought to check out. Project Wild is one, and then Project Learning Tree. You can't really see the name of it, but up in the upper left corner of that Explore Your Environment book, it says Project Learning Tree. But if you took a training in the past, then you don't have the latest and the best that just came out this summer. Okay, another book that I love, always recommend, is a book called Sharing Nature with Children. It has a 1 and a 2. The first one might be the best one. It's just a little paperback, probably not more than 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thick. Lots of great activities. This was written almost 35 years ago, and it still is a classic in activities, simple activities done with kids in the outdoors. I like to stress literature as something that's a powerful way to teach children, and I suspect there's some people nodding their heads and agreeing with me. There are books in the lives of children and adults that were formative in terms of forming their ethic or their way of thinking about things. These are some that were important to many people that we've been told about over the years. The bottom left there, Rascal, was a book that I loved and always think about to this day. But Owl Moon, My Side of the Mountain was also a big one for me. They were written back in the dark ages, and that's why I remember them. The Giving Tree is a book that a lot of kids liked. Many of our forestry students would tell me over the years that Hatchet was a book that influenced them, or Where the Red Fern Grows was one that my boys, who are now grown in their late 30s or mid-late 30s, they found a lot of connection with that book. So literature helps to create a heart for the outdoors, as well as an interest in things natural. And so anything you can do in that regard to encourage reading good literature not only teaches about those concepts, but also, of course, teaches students how to write better. All right, so I told you it was going to be 15 minutes for this. I try to breeze through because whoops. Yeah, let me go back to this. So it's, oh, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can go back. No, it doesn't let me go back. So I want to make sure our stuff is on there. The only quick way for me to do that is here. Let's try that again. Well, I'm fiddling around. Cassidy, why don't you start questions for both Dave and I, because there were a bunch that were appearing in there, and I'll get our information up there too.
Yeah, and we can send it
okay.
in a further email too.
Well, I just want to make sure they know the difference between Dave and I, because I'm the better looking one, and I want to just make sure that everybody knows. Okay.
Very important.
This distinguished looking one.
I don't know why people laugh when I say that, but it's okay.
So yeah, we did have a couple questions. One is there an old growth forest in Pennsylvania that can be visited? Like one that's never been timbered?
Yeah, good question. And yes, there is. And there are some, but it's like they're few and far between. And if you're in the Philadelphia area, like there's one called Pennypacker Reserve, I think is over there, around Harrisburg, or maybe that's towards Harrisburg. Gosh, I don't remember now. Maybe Dave will know. Up in the northwest, there's a place called Heart's Content here in State
Central
College.
PA, we have Alan Seeger.
And there are a few.
Huntington County.
Yeah, there are a few others. And let me tell you this, that they were all cut. Everything was cut. And the only reason why some of these places survived was because there was an argument over who owned them. It wasn't that they were usually being protected. There's a Detweiler Run area here in Huntington County as well. That's old growth, simply because the logging railroad broke down. And then the state bought the land before they could get the railroad down in here. So, okay, there's Dave and I, and there's our contact info too. Next question.
Are we losing some of our forests or trees to pests like lanternflies and the ash tree borers?
Dave, yeah, that's your.
Yeah, so we certainly have lost a lot of trees mortality wise. We haven't lost a species yet, in the sense that there's still hemlock trees and ash trees alive out there. There's a lot of research being done to try to breed for resistance or find biocontrols that can be introduced to control those insect pests. But yeah, there's been millions of trees that have been lost in our state to these invasive insects. I think Sandy pointed out that invasive plants and insects are some of our biggest problems that we're contending with today, certainly.
You know, Dave, I'll just add to that. Sometimes there's a focus on individual trees, and individual trees die from many different things. But when we lose a species, all hell breaks loose. I mean, we lose a piece of a working ecosystem, a machine, so to speak. And that's what the concern is, that sometimes certain species of insects or diseases that come from another place can go rampant and wipe out a species or two, and really changes the nature of the forest.
Which almost happened with the American chestnut tree with chestnut blight. So there are still remnant chestnuts still alive in our woods today, but it essentially took every tree out from Georgia to Maine.
Yeah.
Yeah, on a similar note, we also have a question of, do you see any push to regulate using calorie Bradford pears in landscaping as they're invading, or
Hmm.
any research about that?
That's a smart question.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we advocate to not use it because it has been found to be very invasive. You know, that's kind of the learning curve that we happen upon sometimes with these plants that we try to use in landscaping. We find out in the long run that they can be very invasive. There are a number of them that we'd love to see on our plant lists that prohibit their sale and distribution and such. It's called noxious weed list, and that's regulated by the Department of Agriculture in our state. But the nursery industry is a strong industry and a strong lobbyist, and they still make a lot of money on some of these plants. So sometimes we struggle getting those things added to that noxious weed list when they should be.
Cassidy?
Could you explain a little more about the furnaces in the forests?
Oh, okay. Well, let me just very briefly say there were about 160 to 190 furnaces across Pennsylvania. They were big stone structures that are left today, but they were big industries, and there were homes and buildings all around that. Connected to that furnace, there would have been a big shed, a big barn kind of thing. And that furnace was sort of like a muzzle loader firearm, if you know what that is, or like a cannon. It was loaded from the top. They'd put iron ore and charcoal, and then sometimes other things like limestone and such. And that charcoal would be burned, and then the iron ore would melt and float out at the bottom. And that iron ore, molten iron ore, would go out onto the floor in that shed down at the bottom, and it would form bars. They made impressions in sand there on the floor, and the iron ore would flow into there, and then it would harden, and they got bars of iron. And it sometimes looked like a mother pig with little piglets, so they called that pig iron. It was just a nickname for it. That's how it worked, very briefly. And it was the fuel, wood, it was the trees that were turned into charcoal that then was used as the fuel. So the charcoal, not briquettes, but these are chunks of natural charcoal like you might find in a high-end barbecue situation, or even Walmart sometimes sells Mexican charcoal. And it's pretty cool stuff, but it burns very, very hot. And that's what melted those iron stones. So how did it impact the forest? It took about an acre of forest land per day to feed an iron furnace. And iron furnaces ran about 200 days a year. They couldn't run when all the water was frozen because they used water wheels to blow air into the bottom of the furnace to make that fire burn hot. So 200 acres per day was cut. And so most furnaces had to have at least 20,000 acres of land to stay in business. Go figure, a lot of land.
Who were the guys called that did the charcoal, Sandy? What were they called?
They were called colliers, and that term, if you look it up, means a coal miner. They called charcoal coal. They called it wood coal or natural coal, but it was just charcoal made from wood. It wasn't coal from the ground, mineral coal, you could call that. Where was I going with this? The iron industry was so critical for, everything that people used. I mean, that was the first sort of material that we really started to use in the Industrial Revolution. We weren't making everything out of wood anymore. We were using iron to make things. And so that was big industry.
So if you've been to Pennsylvania, you can see the center furnace mansion, and the stone hearth is still standing there alongside College Avenue, but you need to envision all the other buildings that would have been attached to that. I think that's what a lot of people miss, Sandy, don't understand what was actually surrounding that stone structure.
Yeah, and people will say, oh, there's a furnace near my home and such. Well, find out, because it might not be an iron furnace. It could be a lime kiln or some other kind of furnace that, it's a remnant from that. But the iron furnaces are pretty prevalent in the southern areas, especially south, southern, and then central part of Pennsylvania. And I just want to point out that even though they would have 20,000 acres of land, many of these iron furnaces ran out of fuel. They didn't have enough woods to make charcoal anymore because they cut it so heavily. And so those forests, had to grow back each time. And about 25 years of growth was enough to then cut it again, but they still ran out of wood. And that's why we switched over to coal. and something called coke, which is coal that's been baked in a coke oven. And my ancestors did that kind of work. And that was over towards Pittsburgh. And that's what Andrew Carnegie tapped into. He really figured out how to use coke to make iron rather than wood. And the rest is history.
Interesting. We do have a suggestion to Google Hopewell Village for more info on charcoal and pig iron. It's
Yeah.
outside of Reading and a National Historical Site.
The best in the country to go to, the best place to go. We've got it right here in Pennsylvania.
Cool. Our next question, well, first a comment, you both made such great presentations. What kind of training did you have for your professions?
Experience. No, just kidding.
And a lot of experience goes with it too, though. You can start, Sandy.
All right. Let me just say that, we have an education, and that's what we encourage you to go for, which you're encouraging kids to go for, right? So we both have an education in forestry and different degrees along the way, advanced degrees. We work together. I mean, Dave and I have a history of working together, which goes back to the time when Dave first came to Pennsylvania. I've been here maybe 10 years longer than he has, but or maybe 15 years longer. But Dave and I just are a team and enjoy working together. I'm sure you have colleagues like that too. So we have that background, and then just our experience of answering lots of questions, working with teachers, and our interest in seeing people learn is what drives us, right? I mean, we can't do everything. We hope you can influence young people to be educated and clarify to the kids, that you can get an education in forestry. Usually many of the people they run into in life who say they're forestry people or foresters are not educated. And though they're great folks, they often don't have the formal education background. Dave has a master's in forestry. I have a PhD in forestry, and that doesn't mean we know everything, but we try to combine it with our experience and share that with you.
And a good point that I didn't make in the presentation is that anyone in Pennsylvania can call themselves a forester. There's not a certification or a test that you take to say, okay, now I can hang my shingle up. But, typically we do say that a professional forester is someone that is schooled, does at least have that 2-year technician degree or that 4-year degree. But you can call yourself a forester. There's nothing that's regulating us in our state. Some other states do have regulations around that.
Yeah, and it's kind of equivalent, Dave, to the term teacher. Lots of people can call themselves a teacher, right? I mean, it doesn't have a narrowly defined definition, just that word. And the same with forester. In fact, if you look in a lot of old dictionaries, the term forester means a man who lives in the woods. It doesn't have a professional connotation at all. And so someone who knows forest science might be a better way to put it, or a professional forester, a degreed forester would be what we would recommend that you work with. And someone who's not biased, because there's a lot of money involved in selling trees and timber, for example. And so you have to be very careful if you own timber in Pennsylvania not to make a foolish mistake, because there's people that'll try to take advantage of you. And even within families, there's what I call elder abuse, that we have a lot of elderly people own forest land, and sometimes the husband or the wife dies, and then someone comes in and takes advantage of the widower or the widow. Usually it's a widow, sadly, and they fleece the person.
We do have a professional organization that does certify foresters, and that does require an exam and continuing education to maintain your certification. So there is our professional entity, our organization called the Society of American Foresters, that you can look for to find someone who is certified. And that means they do also have the degree.
We had 2 more questions. Maybe we can answer them very shortly. What had the most impact on Pennsylvania forests since Eastern woodland peoples? And what are your thoughts on the costs of lumber lately?
Let me answer the first one, Dave, and you do the lumber one. Would that work?
Sure.
Okay,
yeah,
so
I can answer it really quickly.
What has had the biggest impact on forest lands in Pennsylvania? Well, in the In the history talk, it was the Industrial Revolution. In the modern era, it's invasive plants and diseases. No doubt about it. They're changing history and they're changing the condition of our forests. In place of invasive plants, animals, insects, those kinds of issues are so serious. They weren't dealing with that during the Industrial Revolution when they were extensively using our forests in an extractive kind of way. They weren't thinking sustainability, except the iron industry was wanting the forest to grow back so they would protect it from cattle grazing and things like that. But that's all I'll say.
And the lumber price is not necessarily what we're dealing with Pennsylvania hardwoods, because our trees typically aren't manufactured into lumber. We're not going to see maple and cherry and oak 2x4s and dimension lumber. And that's where we see the skyrocketing prices. And that has been attributed to mill shutdowns during the pandemic, as well as then high demand because we had people off work that wanted to do projects and other construction kinds of things. So the demand exploded while mills were not producing the amount of wood that they needed to because of workers being laid off and things like that. So we saw the prices just go through the roof, and we still haven't seen that come down. We do have an article that we just posted on that to our extension page that you can find, or contact me. I can send it to you. We just came out in our newsletter.
Yeah, we do a newsletter. It's quarterly right now. We hope maybe it'll be more frequent. And it's a digital newsletter, so it comes in your mailbox and you can click on something. It takes you right to the articles. Dave and Cassidy, would you mind if I said, can we turn the cameras on so we can see the participants? Is that possible or not possible?
We have 40 some people.
Can't do it?
And our time is up, Sandy.
Okay. I love to at least wave to everybody, but this is a virtual wave to our friends and respected colleagues, our teachers.
Thanks for joining us today and taking this course.
We appreciate it. And we are always available, to talk more and help you as a teacher. In particular, I guess I'd be the one that wants to connect with you as a teacher and how you do your jobs. How you
Sandy
teach
is
them.
actually more, we didn't say this in his introduction, but Sandy is more of our natural resource youth specialist and has done a lot of work over his career in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Thank you, Cassidy. It was great. I sure wish we could see people. We'll have to figure out how to do that some days. You sure I couldn't switch a wire in the back of my computer?
Next year, some of them will be back, I'm sure, to see the face-to-face program.
Oh, yeah. That's
Cassidy, I think you're muted, Cassidy.
Yep, yeah. I am. I'm sure a lot of people will.
and Cassidy, I'll just add that I'm spending some time in the Arboretum of Penn State. Many of you have heard about that. We'd love to have you visit. Bring a group of kids, bring your colleagues, whatever. The Arboretum at Penn State is kind of a fun place to visit. Lots of cool things going on there. And just this week, just yesterday, we opened something called the Pollinator and Bird Garden, which is about a 2-acre experience. Very educational, not just looking at flowers. Very, very educational about pollinators and pollinating plants and natural ecosystems. So we'd love to have you come. Again, you can contact me and I'll be looking for you and I'll make sure you get a good tour.
Very cool. Well, thank you both very much. And thank you to all of our attendees, and make sure you make good use of all the resources.